October 14, 1943, 1647 hours. Thorpe Abbotts, England. The B-17 Flying Fortress came to a halt on the runway, its number 3 engine completely out of order and number 2 emitting smoke. Lieutenant Colonel James Shannon examined the damage as he walked around the aircraft. There were 17 holes in the left wing, 23 in the fuselage, and 8 more near the tail gunner's position. The plane's metal surface looked like a strainer. Lieutenant Frank Morrison, the navigator, climbed down from the nose hatch, drenched in sweat despite the freezing temperatures at 25,000 feet. "Skipper, we shouldn't be alive," Morrison said with a strained voice. "Jerry threw everything at us over Schweinfurt." Shannon ran his hand over a row of bullet holes along the fuselage, narrowly missing the fuel tanks. Around them, other fortresses were landing, some trailing smoke, others signaling with red flares indicating casualties on board. Of the 291 B-17s that had set out to bomb the ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt that morning, 60 didn't return and 17 were considered beyond repair. 121 of the surviving planes would require major repairs before they could fly again. The statistics were grim at this rate. The chance of a bomber crew surviving their required 25 mission tour was under 30%. However, while Colonel Shannon pondered how they had survived, 200 miles away in an unassuming apartment building near Columbia University in Manhattan, a Hungarian Jewish refugee mathematician was about to crack a problem that would save the lives of hundreds of bomber crews. His name was Abraham Wald, and his breakthrough would change military strategy and revolutionize statistical analysis. The data from the damaged B-17s, like the one Shannon flew, was exactly the kind the United States Army Air Forces had been collecting for months. Each returning bomber was carefully examined, with bullet holes mapped and cataloged. Technical sergeants would walk around the aircraft, marking damage locations on standardized charts. The results were consistent. The fuselage took the most hits, averaging 1.73 bullet holes per square foot, followed by the wings at 1.21 holes per square foot. The fuel system showed 1.55 hits per square foot, but areas like the engines and cockpit showed very little damage, sometimes as few as 0.3 hits per square foot. To the military leadership at Wright Field in Ohio, the solution seemed clear. Major General Oliver Eccles, head of the Material Command, had convened a meeting in September 1943. "Gentlemen, the data speaks for itself," he said, pointing to a chart illustrating damage distribution on a B-17 silhouette. "We need to reinforce the areas that are taking the most damage, add armor plating to the fuselage, and strengthen the wings." The reasoning same sound. You should add armor to the areas that are hit the most. But there was an issue weight. A B-17G already weighed 36,135 pounds when empty. Adding armor would reduce bomb load, fuel capacity, and maneuverability. The Fortress could carry about 1,500 pounds of extra armor, but it had to be placed strategically. Putting it in the wrong spots would add unnecessary weight without providing any real protection. The Air Force needed precise mathematics, not intuition. 6 weeks before the fateful Schweinfurt raid, the problem had been assigned to the Statistical Research Group, SRG, at Columbia University. The SRG occupied 3 floors of an apartment building near the Columbia campus with blacked-out windows for security. Its existence was mostly unknown, even to many in the military. Inside, 18 of the country's top mathematical minds worked, recruited through a network of academic statisticians. They had already solved various problems, from naval convoy patterns to the probability of hitting targets with the Norden bomb sight. Abraham Wald had joined the group in 1943, one of many European refugee scholars who would have a significant impact on the American war effort. Born in 1902 in Kadva, part of Austria-Hungary, now Cluj-Napoca, Romania, Wald had been homeschooled by his parents because, as an Orthodox Jew, he couldn't attend school on Saturdays due to Hungarian law. His mathematical brilliance earned him a position at the University of Vienna, but after the Anschluss in 1938, he fled to the U.S. and was offered a position at Columbia University. Instead of focusing on pure mathematics, Wald was now using his skills to help save American airmen's lives. In late August 1943, the Air Force delivered their data to the SRG boxes of reports, thousands of damage assessments, photographs, and measurements. Captain Robert McNamara, who was working with the Air Force's Office of Statistical Control, had overseen the data collection. Each returning bomber from the 8th Air Force in England had been analyzed. The patterns were clear: heavy damage to the fuselage and wings, minimal damage to the engines and cockpit. Wald spent 3 days reviewing the data in silence. His colleague, economist Milton Friedman, later recalled, Abraham would sit there smoking his pipe, saying nothing for hours. Then suddenly, he'd make a mark on paper and return to silence. The other statisticians in the SRG had ... The team had already started calculating the optimal distribution of armor based on hit frequency. When Wald finally spoke up at their September 2nd meeting, "You are all wrong," he said simply. "The Air Force is wrong. You're looking at this backwards." The room fell silent. Frederick Mastella, a young statistician who would later become the president of the American Statistical Association, asked what everyone was thinking. "Abraham, the data is clear. These areas are taking the most damage. How can reinforcing them be wrong?" Wald stood up and walked to the blackboard. He drew an outline of the B-17 and marked the areas showing heavy damage based on the Air Force's data. "These planes returned," he said. "They took this damage and still survived." He pointed to the fuselage and wings and explained that every plane they examined took hits here and still made it home. Then he drew another B-17 outline and asked, "Where are the planes that didn't return? What did their damage patterns look like?" He marked the areas showing little damage on the surviving planes, engines, cockpit, and tail control surfaces. If damage were truly random, he argued, the distribution should be equal across all areas. But the missing damage was evident on the missing planes. This insight struck like a lightning bolt. Statistician Leonard Jimmy Savage later called it one of the most elegant revelations of the war. Wald had recognized that the Air Force was only seeing half of the picture, the half of the planes that made it back. Mathematically, Wald explained, "Let's assume enemy fire is random. If fire is random, damage should be evenly spread across the aircraft." He wrote out probability distributions. If we see non-uniform damage on returning planes and assume fire is random, we must conclude that aircraft hit in underrepresented areas didn't make it back. These are the critical areas, and they are the ones that need armor. George Stigler, an economist who would later win a Nobel Prize in 1982, was in the room and wrote, "It was so obvious once Abraham explained it, yet none of us had seen it. We were all looking at the data, but Abraham was looking at what wasn't in the data." The implications were huge. The Air Force had been preparing to add armor to the areas that could withstand damage while leaving critical areas exposed. This could have worsened their losses instead of improving them. Wald's insight cut through months of planning with pure mathematical logic. Wald wasn't finished. Over the next 3 weeks, he developed a detailed mathematical model for optimal armor placement. His work, later compiled into 8 memoranda, went beyond mere observation. He calculated vulnerability coefficients for various areas of the aircraft, considering not only the probability of being hit, but also the importance of each area. For example, A hit to the aileron control cables would be far more disastrous than multiple hits to non-structural fuselage areas. On September 20, 1943, Wald presented his full analysis to Air Force representatives. Brigadier General Orville Anderson, head of the 8th Bomber Command, flew in from England for the meeting. Anderson was skeptical. "Professor Wald, you're asking us to ignore the actual damage we can see in armor areas that appear undamaged?" Wald presented a statistical analysis of the previous month's losses. "General, your loss rates are unsustainable. In August, you lost 60 B-17s while bombing Schweinfurt and Regensburg. That's 600 men. Your own data shows that 38 of those aircraft suffered engine failures before they went down. Engine armor could have saved them." He presented another chart. "Here's your June rate on Kiel. You lost 26 aircraft. Witnesses from returning crews say at least 15 went down after cockpit hits. Yet, in your surviving aircraft, cockpit damage is minimal. This is not a coincidence. This is what I call survivorship bias. We only see the survivors." The term survivorship bias was new and was coined by Wald during his analysis. It would become fundamental to statistical analysis, but at that time it was a revolutionary concept. Anderson examined the data and then asked his aide, Major Thomas Powers, for the latest loss reports. The numbers were unsustainable. The 8th Air Force was losing planes faster than they could replace them. "How much weight are we talking about?" Anderson asked. Wald had anticipated this. "Based on my calculations, 1,200 pounds of armor, optimally placed around the engines, cockpit, and control cables, would be more effective than 2,000 pounds spread according to the observed damage patterns." The challenge wasn't just mathematical but practical. The B-17's Wright Cyclone engines were already prone to mechanical failure without enemy fire. Adding armor would require redesigning engine cowlings, shifting weight distributions, and recalculating the center of gravity. Boeing engineer Edward Wells, who had helped design the B-17, was brought in for consultation. "It's possible," he said after reviewing Wald's recommendations, "but it means retrofitting every B-17 in England." By October 1943, when Black Thursday saw 77 B-17s lost in a single day, the Air Force was desperate. General Henry Hap Arnold, the commanding general of the Army Air Forces, personally ordered the implementation of Wald's recommendations. The retrofit program began immediately. Crews at modification centers in England World War II worked around the clock at modification centers, adding armor plates to engines, installing bulletproof glass in critical cockpit areas, and reinforcing control cables. Technical Sergeant William Haney, working at the Huntington Modification Center, recalled the urgency of the task. "We had planes coming in all shot up from missions, and we were trying to patch them while adding these new armor kits." Orders were to prioritize Wald's modifications over everything except critical repairs. The changes weren't immediately popular with the crews. Captain Robert Morgan, the pilot of the famous Memphis Belle, which had completed 25 missions on May 17, 1943, was initially skeptical. "We're already flying overloaded. Now they want to add more weight to areas that never get hit," he said. But Morgan was reflecting on his personal experience, his own survival, not realizing he was part of the statistical bias Wald had identified. The first modified B-17s flew combat missions in November 1943, and the results were immediate and dramatic. Loss rates began to decline even as mission intensity increased. By December 1943, despite flying deeper into Germany than ever before, the 8th Air Force's loss rate per sortie dropped from 9.1% to 3.5%. The modification program expanded rapidly, eventually applying to all American heavy bombers. Lieutenant Colonel John Bennett, who flew 31 missions in both modified and unmodified B-17s, noticed a distinct difference. My first tour, every mission felt like Russian roulette. After the modifications, we still got shot up, but more planes made it home. Crews that would have gone down were limping back. The numbers told the story. In the 6 months before Wald's modifications, the 8th Air Force lost 66 B-17s. In the 6 months after the full implementation of the modifications, despite flying more missions and against better defended targets, losses dropped to 37. Each bomber saved meant 10 men who returned home instead of becoming casualties or prisoners of war. But Wald's impact went far beyond just armor placement. His work revolutionized military analysis. The Navy applied his methods to ship survival, and the British RAF retroactively analyzed their own bomber losses, finding similar patterns. Even the Germans, through captured documents, learned of Wald's work and applied similar analysis to their own aircraft. Colonel Curtis LeMay, who would later lead the strategic bombing campaign against Japan, studied Wald's memoranda obsessively. "Wald taught us to look for what wasn't there," he wrote. "In war, the most important data is often the data you can't collect." Wald's concept had immediate applications beyond aviation. When medics analyzed infantry casualties, they realized they were seeing only the soldiers who survived long enough to reach aid stations. This insight led to changes in battlefield first aid priorities, focusing on injuries that could be survivable with immediate intervention. Back at the Statistical Research Group, Wald's success with bomber survivability led to expanded responsibilities. He developed sequential analysis methods for quality control and ammunition production, saving millions of rounds from unnecessary testing. He also created optimal search patterns for finding downed pilots in the Pacific, saving many lives. Herbert Solomon, another SRG statistician, later reflected on Wald's unique approach. Most of us looked at problems directly. Abraham always asked what we weren't seeing. Wald had survived the Holocaust by escaping Austria just in time, and perhaps that made him more attuned to the danger of only counting survivors. The human impact of his work was felt in countless individual stories. Staff Sergeant James Hensley, a ball-turret gunner with the 381st Bomb Group, was hit by flak over Berlin in March 1944. A shell fragment came right through the turret, hitting the armor plate they'd added behind his head. Before Wald's modifications, that would have killed me. "Instead, I just got my bell rung," Hensley said. Technical Sergeant Roy Vasquez, a flight engineer with the 91st Bomb Group, had a similar experience. "I lost number 2 engine to flak over Frankfurt before the armor upgrades. Losing an engine usually meant fire, then bail out or blow up, but the armor protected the fuel lines. We made it home on 3 engines. The modifications weren't without their drawbacks. Some crews complained about reduced speed and maneuverability. The added weight meant longer takeoff runs, which were critical when operating from England's often foggy and shortened runways. Fuel consumption increased slightly, but these drawbacks were nothing compared to the improved survival rates." By early 1944, Wald's work had become standard doctrine. The Air Force's Statistical Control Office, led by Charles Tex Thornton, integrated survivorship bias analysis into all operational planning. When the P-51 Mustang was introduced as a long-range escort fighter, analysts used Wald's methods to determine optimal fuel tank armor, significantly reducing losses to ground fire. Wald's influence extended to the Pacific theater as well. B-29 Superfortresses bombing Japan received armor configurations based on Wald's analysis, adapted for Pacific conditions. Navy dive bombers and torpedo planes were similarly protected. Marine Corps' aviation units reported dramatic improvements in aircraft survivability during island-hopping campaigns. Captain Robert McNamara, who had helped collect the original bomber damage data, would later become the U.S. Secretary of Defense. Bomber had been retrofitted with armor based on Wald's recommendations. The difference in survivability was evident in every mission flown, with bomber crews reporting greater confidence and improved morale. The armor modifications not only increased the likelihood of survival, but also allowed crews to continue pushing forward in the air war against Germany with more certainty that their aircraft could withstand damage and still make it home. Wald's work had far-reaching effects beyond the bomber fleets. The concept of survivorship bias began influencing military strategies across all branches of the U.S. Armed Forces. By focusing on the data of what wasn't seen, Wald's insights saved countless lives, with his methods being adapted for use in other military campaigns, including the Pacific Theater. The U.S. Navy and Marines applied similar strategies to improve the survivability of their aircraft and ships, while the Army used the concept to reassess their approach to infantry casualties and battlefield first aid. The lasting impact of Wald's contributions extended into peacetime as well. His work became foundational in the fields of risk analysis and statistical modeling, shaping everything from business practices to the development of scientific methodologies in various industries. The statistical techniques he pioneered would go on to become critical in fields as diverse as medicine, engineering, and economics. As for Wald, despite his vital role in saving so many lives, he remained humble. In an interview with the Columbia University newspaper in 1944, he downplayed his achievements, attributing his success to applying standard statistical thinking to the available data. He credited the airmen who provided the data for analysis as the real heroes, yet his contribution to the war effort and to military strategy was undeniable. He was able to provide a framework that moved military analysis away from purely intuitive and observational practices, making it more scientifically rigorous. His ability to identify and address survivorship bias helped shape the course of the war and save thousands of lives. The pressure and emotional toll of his work were immense. Constantly reviewing casualty reports and analyzing the devastating effects of war, coupled with the responsibility of knowing his calculations directly impacted the lives of soldiers, wore on Wald. His colleagues noticed the toll it took on him, with Alan Wallace observing that Wald aged noticeably during his time with the SRG. Yet, despite this, Wald continued to refine his work, producing further memoranda on armor placement, thickness, and trade-offs between armor and other defensive systems. By D-Day in June 1944, his work had become standard across the U.S. Army Air Forces, and the results spoke for themselves. Loss rates continued to drop, and the improved survivability of aircraft and airmen allowed for more sustained and aggressive operations against the German military. The legacy of Wald's mathematical insight remained a testament to the power of statistical thinking in saving lives and influencing the course of history. By the time of the D-Day invasion, every heavy bomber flying over Europe had incorporated Wald's modifications. This massive air support for the invasion, which involved over 11,000 sorties in the first 24 hours, was made possible because the loss rates had been reduced to sustainable levels. General Dwight D. Eisenhower later stated that air superiority, achieved through acceptable bomber losses, was crucial to the success of the invasion. The statistics from D-Day were a clear reflection of Wald's impact. Despite facing intense anti-aircraft fire from German positions, the 8th Air Force lost only 28 bombers from over 1,200 dispatched, resulting in a loss rate of just 2.3%. A year earlier, before Wald's work, similar operations had seen loss rates exceeding 10%. Post-war analysis confirmed the full scope of Wald's contribution. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted immediately after the German surrender, examined the wreckage of American bombers in Nazi-occupied territories. The damage patterns on these lost aircraft confirmed Wald's predictions exactly, showing catastrophic damage to engines, cockpits, and control systems precisely where he had recommended armor placement. Even the German Luftwaffe, through captured records, recognized Wald's influence. One German fighter squadron commander noted in December 1943, "The fortresses have become flying tanks. Hits that destroyed them 6 months ago now barely slow them down." This recognition led the Germans to adapt their tactics, focusing more on engine shots, which made attacks on bombers even more difficult and dangerous. As a result, German pilot losses increased as they tried to counter Wald's innovations. Wald's work extended beyond military applications and had a lasting influence on fields like statistics, economics, finance, and medicine. The concept of survivorship bias, which Wald had so brilliantly identified, became a fundamental principle in these disciplines. For instance, in finance, it explained why mutual fund performance appeared better than it actually was by excluding the funds that failed. In medicine, it revealed why certain treatments seemed more effective by only considering patients who survived long enough to complete the treatment. In business, it highlighted why copying successful companies often failed, as it ignored the many companies that had tried the same strategies and failed. Colonel Jacob Beezer, who would later serve as a weapon officer on both atomic bomb missions, studied Wald's work extensively. Wald taught us that in any analysis, you must ask who isn't in the room, who didn't survive to be counted, what data is missing because it died with its source. Beezer said, "The human cost of the air war remains staggering despite Wald's improvements. The 8th Air Force alone lost 26,000 men killed and 28,000 wounded or captured. However, statistical analysis suggested that these numbers could have been 30 to 40% higher without the survivorship bias-based modifications, meaning that approximately 10,000 additional casualties were prevented through Wald's mathematical insight. There were personal stories that illuminated these statistics. Lieutenant Richard Cole, who had flown with Doolittle on the famous Tokyo raid, survived 26 missions over Europe in a modified B-17. "I saw planes identical to mine go down from engine hits," he said. "The only difference was my engine armor. That's why I'm here talking to you." Sergeant Anthony Picardi, a radio operator, had an even more direct experience. He took a 20mm cannon shell to the cockpit armor. It blew a hole in the plexiglass, but the armor stopped it. "The pilot got some scratches from the glass, but that's all," Picardi said. Before Wald, that's 2 dead men and a crashed bomber. The modification program continued evolving throughout the war. Each generation of bombers incorporated lessons learned from the previous one. The B-29 Superfortress, which was designed with Wald's principles in mind from the start, had the lowest loss rate of any American heavy bomber. Despite flying the most dangerous missions over Japan, Wald's influence also extended to adversary analysis. His methods were used to study German fighter tactics, Japanese naval strategies, and even enemy industrial production. The concept of missing data became crucial in intelligence analysis, shaping how the U.S. military approached wartime strategy. In March 1945, as the war in Europe neared its end, Wald received a commendation from General Henry Hop Arnold, which read simply, "Your mathematical insight has saved countless American lives. The nation is in your debt." Wald, ever modest, shared the credit with his entire SRG team. "I merely applied standard statistical thinking to available data," he said in a rare interview with the Columbia University newspaper in 1944. The real heroes are the airmen who fly these missions and provide U.S. with the data to analyze. After the war, Wald's influence didn't end. The newly formed RAND Corporation recruited many members of the SRG, including several who had worked directly with Wald. They applied his methods to nuclear strategy, space programs, and eventually to planning for the Vietnam War. Tragically, Wald did not live to see the full impact of his work. On December 13, 1950, while on a lecture tour in India, the Air India DC-3 carrying him and his wife crashed into the Nilgiri Mountains in southern India. He was just 48 years old. The irony of his death in a plane crash after saving so many aircraft was not lost on his colleagues. At his memorial service, Frederick Mastella said, "Abraham Wald saw what others could not, the ghosts in the data, the missing pieces that told the real story. He saved more lives with mathematics than most generals save with armies." In 1985, the 8th Air Force Association erected a memorial at their museum in Savannah, Georgia, alongside tributes to famous commanders and Medal of Honor recipients. A plaque reads, "To the mathematician who saw the unseen and saved the unturned." Retired Technical Sergeant Harold Smith, speaking at the dedication, put it simply, "Most of us never heard his name during the war, but thousands of us came home because of him. He looked at holes in metal and saw men who would live or die. That's mathematics with a soul." The B-17G on display at the museum bears the armor configuration Wald recommended. Docents explained to visitors how a refugee mathematician's insight about missing data saved more American airmen than any single tactical innovation of the war. They point to the armor around the engines, the reinforced cockpit, and the protected control cables, all placed not where damage was seen, but where it wasn't. While this concept seems obvious now, it took genius to see that the bombers that didn't return held the key to protecting those that did. Abraham Wald's ability to perceive the invisible, his understanding that the absence of evidence could be evidence, itself revolutionized not only military aviation but the entire field of data analysis. Today, every time an analyst asks, "What am I not seeing?" or questions whether their data represents all cases or just survivors, they honor Wald's legacy. He taught the world that the most important information could be what's missing, that survival itself can blind us to vulnerability, and that mathematics, when properly applied, can illuminate truths hidden in plain sight. Wald's own survival story exemplified his theory. He had escaped Austria just before the Holocaust consumed the Jewish mathematical community there, including many of his University of Vienna colleagues. Only those who fled survived to continue their work. The missing data, the murdered mathematicians, represented insights lost forever. Wald's survival itself was a form of bias, representing only those fortunate enough to escape in time. His work saved hundreds of bomber crews directly and influenced military thinking in ways that saved thousands more. But perhaps his greatest contribution was teaching humanity to question not just what we see, but what we don't see. To always ask who's missing from the room, what data died with its source. In a world overflowing with information, Wald's insight remains crucial that the most important facts may be those we'll never collect, the planes that never came home, the stories that ended before they could be told. His mathematics was elegant, his application practical, but the lesson was profound. In trying to protect bombers, Abraham Wald discovered a fundamental truth about knowledge itself. We are all survivors, and our survival shapes what we think we know. Only by acknowledging the missing, counting the uncounted, and remembering the unreturned can we truly approach real understanding.